talking about the fact that many don't know, it is also a fact that many people did know historically about what existed under the waters of Colombo. There is a long history of diving in Sri Lanka, and particularly in Colombo, where most of the diving originated. Initially, diving started more in a kind of a commercial sense, harbor port divers working to kind of do construction or salvage with harbor construction and ship repair. And eventually there was a very enthusiastic group of underwater hobbies. In that time, around the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, of course, people tend to engage in diving along with things like spearfishing and, collecting things. But there was a sense of adventure and exploration. And a lot of these pioneers, particularly people like Rodney Jonkless, who many consider kind of the godfather of modern Sri Lankan diving, and many others who kind of contributed a lot to the knowledge we have about Colombo's marine biodiversity and Sri Lanka's marine biodiversity. Some of these got documented in publications. I've just put a picture of the book Reefs of Tapro Bain. It's one of several books written by Arthur Clarke about diving in Sri Lanka, and he mentioned several times about diving in Colombo as well. I know Rex De Silva from WNPS used to dive extensively in Colombo. Actually, these images are from his Facebook group, Reef Comber's History of Diving in Sri Lanka, and he's been documenting some of the history of diving in Sri Lanka. So people like Rex were also involved in kind of that earlier days of diving exploration as well. So there was a small group of enthusiasts who knew, and then it kind of grew into a small yet slightly larger group of enthusiasts with things like the Sri Lanka Sub-Aqua Club, Dr. Malik Fernando, who's a member of the WNPS, who played a big role in kind of promoting diving. I was one of those people who actually joined the club and kind of expanded my diving as well. So there has been a growth, but in recent times, of course, it has got into the public domain a lot more. So the question of saying, how can there be any marine biodiversity or anything interesting in our oceans? If you look around Colombo, everything looks, very urbanized, and there's so much construction, and the way we look at the ocean, we don't think that there is anything worth seeing. So, and most of us just are on land looking out towards sea, looking at the ocean. But I'm going to turn it the other way, and this is a picture taken by one of my friends, Darshan Jayawardena. I've taken it from his website. This is from a boat looking back towards Colombo. A site that those of us who dive in Colombo get to see very regularly. So Colombo is actually really well located because it's exposed to the open sea. There is good circulation. Strong ocean currents kind of wash our coastline, which is really important for promoting marine life. There is an input of nutrients from freshwater sources like the Kalani River, the Bolgoda estuary. So there is all these land-based nutrients that enter the sea, and then it's kind of circulated well with these ocean currents. We have what we call presence of hard substrates, primarily in rocky reefs. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And also shipwrecks and other structures that are very important for marine life to settle and grow on. Things like corals to settle and grow on. There's also relatively low fishing in Colombo. Now, I have to put a disclaimer here that there is no place in Sri Lanka that actually has really low fishing. Sri Lanka is an intensively fished marine area. But relative to other parts of Sri Lanka, the fishing pressure is lower. And we don't see the same use of destructive fishing methods of Colombo. Things like dynamite, which has been a big problem in other parts of Sri Lanka, it has never been practiced off Colombo. So that has been a factor in ensuring that some of the marine life survives. And the Colombo Harbor, which is a double-edged sword, as you'll know later through this presentation, and you already know, there is a lot of negative impacts, but it has also brought amazing riches for divers because this has been historically an important harbor where many ships were moving through. And this has resulted in several of these sinking. And as divers, they have provided us with amazing diving opportunities and habitats for marine life as well. So what do we have around Colombo? There are extensive sandstone reefs. Many of these run parallel to the shoreline. They are remnants of former coastlines when the sea level was lower. So as the sea level increased, these things got inundated and got further and further away from shore. So you have several kind of ridges that run parallel to the shoreline. You will see the first one actually when you look, if you're driving on Marine Drive, you see the waves breaking a few hundred meters off the beach. You see that shipwreck in front of the Kinross Swimming Club as well. It's kind of sitting on top of the reef. So that's the first reef. Then about 800 meters out to sea, there's another reef locally known as the Palagala. And then there's a third reef called the Vatiagala. And there's another small reef called Degalmada between the second and third reefs. Degalmada between the two rocks, so between the two reefs. So those are very extensive. These reefs run for many kilometers from around Fort area all the way sometimes down to Wadua. They are continuous reef systems and these harbor a lot of marine life. There are also, comes as a surprise to many people, that there are actually true coral reefs. Now the sandstone reefs do have some corals growing on them, but they are rock patches, but with corals settling on them. But there are actual offshore coral reefs in Colombo. These are what we call patch reefs. They're kind of raised mounds on the sea floor. And these are also found quite offshore, not right near the shore, partly because corals really like, lots of corals like very clear water. So when you get offshore from Colombo, the water is actually clear. Even with all the pollution now, the inshore waters are quite murky and the visibility is bad. You can't see very far. But when you get offshore, the water is quite clear and you get these reefs. They're a little bit deep, not like the reefs you find in Hikadu or Pigeon Island. These are deeper. They're at about 20 meters depth. But they have very high coral cover. Currently, they probably have more corals than places like Hikadu. Now, they're not always the corals that people traditionally think of, these big branching corals, but they're different shapes, but they're all actual live hard corals, and they're important habitats. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a high number of shipwrecks, which attract a lot of marine life and provide that substrate for things to settle on. And these are habitats for large numbers of marine life, including very healthy amounts of fish life. I just point out that all the underwater images I will use today during this talk were taken underwater in Colombo. So they are reflecting what you can actually see, and many of them are quite recent, up till even like 3 months ago or 4 months ago. So it reflects what you can see in Colombo to this day. So very healthy fish life. There's also all the other kind of marine life, things like turtles, marine mammals. I won't talk too much about marine mammals. It's not really my expertise, but you do find dolphins very regularly when you're going out diving off the coast of Colombo, sometimes quite close to shore. Whales pass by as well. So, which is what I meant visiting pelagics. Or pelagics are kind of more open ocean marine animals that sometimes come into coastal areas. So whales being the most prominent pelagics or large marine mammals. You also get certain types of sharks, things like whale sharks, which are the largest fish in the world. Big rays like manta rays, eagle rays, big fish like tuna and wahoo and big trevally. These all kind of use these habitats throughout the year. So this is a picture of one of the sandstone reefs. I'm going to just run through a set of pictures rather than have a lot of text. It's an informal chat today. So this is actually a picture of the Degalmada reef. This one is taken off Vallavatta, about a few kilometers off the coast. So these are one of the sandstone ridges that you find off the coast. You can see some nice fish life. There's in the center, this blue-ringed angelfish, very common angelfish on Sri Lankan reefs. And you can, I don't know how clear it is on your screens, but if you're on a computer, you will see it clearly. You can see these soft corals, these kind of purple, blue soft corals growing on these rocks. And this is a very, very unique feature of these reefs. Many of them have these kind of blue sea fans and small soft corals growing all over the reefs. And they're very colorful kind of habitats. And this is a picture of one of the offshore patch reefs or coral reefs. Again, if you look at the bottom here, you see all these different colors and things like kind of cabbage leaves and plates on the bottom. That is all live coral. It is live hard coral. just like the branching corals you might see at Pigeon Island. They're just a different species. But you get extensive areas like this off Colombo, and lots of fish and other marine life invertebrates you can find on them. So these are the type of patch reefs I was discussing. And these things are usually flat. They don't have very high structures, but you have these isolated coral structures or domes. So you have these massive corals that grow very slowly over thousands of years, and they form, big domes. And then you find these isolated coral heads like this. We call them bommies. The word bommies actually comes from Australia. It's an Australian Aboriginal term, I think, referring to some kind of raised hump. So Australian scientists started using this for describing these coral heads. And a lot of coral reef scientists, including myself, have kind of picked up on that word. It's commonly used. So this is one of these bommies on those offshore reefs. And you can see all the fish tend to congregate. If you go to the earlier picture, you don't see many fish. So a lot of these areas you don't see a lot of fish. But then when you get to these bommies, you will find all the fish congregating there. And you have a vast number of fish around these. So as a diver, this is kind of what you look for. You kind of swim around looking for these bommies, and then you sit there and you can take all your pictures, do your research, everything. So these reefs also have sea fans. So some of the deeper areas of Colombo have these large Gorgonian sea fans. These are also a type of coral, and these grow quite large. This particular one is about 2 meters across. There are a couple of reefs where you get kind of almost gardens of these sea fans. Hundreds or maybe thousands of these sea fans growing together. They're really beautiful. These are found a little bit deep at about 30 to 35 meters. And the sea fans usually grow in places where there are strong currents because they're filter feeders. So they kind of, like this basket or fan kind of sticks up into the current, and the current passes through, and small organisms and plankton are captured by the coral animal. So it looks like a tree, but as you know, corals are animals, and this is a type of coral. These are really, really beautiful and very fragile ecosystems as well. They're very easily damaged by ship anchors or fishing nets. So they're very fragile ecosystems, but you do get them. And there's not many places that we know of in Sri Lanka where you have these sea fan gardens. So Colombo is kind of unique in having several of these. And I mentioned earlier that when you get offshore in Colombo, the water is quite clear. Now, this is again a picture of one of those offshore patch reefs. You can see the water is very clear. If you get out on a day, especially around February and March when the sea is at its calmest, the visibility on these is as good as anywhere in Sri Lanka, probably better than many places that people dive in. Very, very clear water with a nice blue hue. It's beautiful for photography, and you have all these schools of fish kind of swimming around. Now, these reefs actually harbor a lot of marine life as well. As a fish ecologist, I tend to be a bit biased towards fish, but these range from the very familiar, like anemone fish. Many of you might refer to them as clownfish. They actually call anemone fish because they live in the sea anemones. So these are commonly found, especially on the offshore reefs of Colombo. Like I said, all these pictures are from Colombo. So you get them around Colombo as well. To very small fish. Now, this is a whip coral goby. This fish is maybe about 1.5 centimeters long, maximum 2 centimeters long, if I remember right, the photograph. This photograph I took around January this year. These live on these whip corals. These whip corals they look like whips from the seafloor. They kind of stick up into the water column. And you have these tiny gobies that just kind of crawl along these whip corals, jump along on these. They're really hard to spot, but if you look closely at most whip corals when you're diving, you will find these whip coral gobies. They are very small. So there are lots of these small animals that many divers tend to overlook. Just like on land, if you go to a rainforest, you have all these tiny animals that many people miss. But there is quite an abundance of these small fish and a high diversity, many of which we haven't really documented well globally, not just in Sri Lanka. We also have I wouldn't say bizarre, but kind of interesting and unique fish as well. This is a leaf scorpion fish. Scorpion fish all have venomous dorsal spines. So if you look at this one, the dorsal on the back, the fin actually has spines that are venomous. So if you touch them or if you step on them, they can inject a venom into you. That's a defense mechanism that they use. And these leaf scorpions are really popular with underwater photographers. I think underwater photographers are closest to ornithologists in that sense, that while we all like to photograph big things, they can go crazy around one specific rare animal. You know of ornithologists who will travel to another country just to photograph one rare bird and trek in a rainforest for days to find that. It's the same with serious underwater photographers. Indonesia is very well known for this, and there are people who will fly to Indonesia, then do a domestic flight, then get on a ferry, and then do, go through 3 days of travel to get to some remote corner of Indonesia, and then dive for days and days to photograph one fish, which if you're not into it, we look at it and say it's not even a very pretty fish, but it's a unique animal. So this leaf scorpion fish is something like that. It's not commonly seen, and it's difficult to spot. So you have to look very carefully. And it's a really interesting, I think it's quite pretty, but some don't. But it's a great subject, a popular subject for underwater photographers. And talking of kind of unique animals, this is a common fish found off Colombo. It's an electric ray, a type of ray that generates an electric voltage up to 220 volts. So as much as your domestic household supply. They use this to numb fish, their prey, which they consume. It's also a defense mechanism. So I wouldn't advise any diver to touch these unless you want to recharge your camera battery or something. But they're very common around Colombo. They're not aggressive, they're docile, but they're very, very interesting animals, and they do generate a nice shock of electricity through a special organ that they have in their body. Now, talking of rays, we also have these bigger rays. This is a big whip ray or bull ray found. This one is off one of the offshore reefs in Colombo, and very large. This one may be about 2 meters, 1.5 to 2 meters across. And they are bottom feeders, very common in Sri Lanka, heavily fished in many areas. So their numbers are actually quite low now, but naturally they used to be quite common, and you can still see a few. If you look very closely at the tail, you can see kind of, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but there is kind of a barb sticking out of the tail. So that's the stinger of a stingray. So if you kind of step on it or something, they can also inject a venom. Again, a defense mechanism, not an attacking tool. So talking of rays, you also have these non-bottom dwelling rays, and these are pelagic species. Eagle rays are frequently seen around Colombo. They are usually pelagic. They move across large areas, so they might move around Sri Lanka or potentially across to other countries as well. But they do frequently visit reefs and wrecks around Sri Lanka, and including Colombo. And of course, talking of fish, as someone who loves fish, the whale shark, the biggest fish in the world. These are actually frequently seen around Colombo. They move past Sri Lanka and past Colombo, especially around the period from February to April on the west coast. Little before the southwest monsoon hits, you have a push of ocean currents bringing nutrients closer to the shore. So you have like plankton and stuff upwelling or gathering near the shoreline, and a congregation of small fish. So fishermen usually go out fishing at this time to catch the small fish like sardines, the handellas, the small fish. That's when the mardalas and the beach saints start catching all these small fish. And you can actually, once you start knowing these patterns, you can even predict the fish prices. You see the price of saleas and handellas dropping around March because there's an abundance. Then during the monsoon time, they catch more offshore fish like tuna. So then the price of that goes. So these are how people fish seasonally. And just like the fishermen went out, the big pelagics like whale sharks also know these things. So they kind of move in closer to shore at this time, and they can be found feeding. They are filter feeders, or they also sometimes feed on small sardines and things. So they kind of come in to areas, especially where the currents hit a hard substrate and upwell, or when the current hits something and goes up and drives the food upwards, you can find them feeding around these structures. So the wrecks around Colombo are a perfect place for these animals because they're high, they're much higher than the reefs from the bottom. So they actually create more upwelling or more congregation of plankton and small fish than some of the reefs. So you can quite frequently find these whale sharks coming and swimming around these wrecks. So this picture is from Dehiwala. We had a very unique phenomena for about 2 years in 2017 and 2018 when we had a very high number of whale sharks. Now, I said we do see them frequently, but those 2 years we had a lot of whale sharks. I mean, pretty much every day you went diving, you would almost see a whale shark every day. We don't know truly what happened. It's now gone back to a normal routine. They're not as common as they were in that year, but we still see whale sharks pretty much every year. So again, this is a whale shark on a wreck. You can see the scale of the animal. There's a diver underneath. So it's a pretty large fish. They can grow up to about 12 meters or 45 feet. The ones that come to Sri Lanka are usually between 6 to 8 meters. They are kind of juveniles and subadults in this area. So here's a video of a whale shark on one of the wrecks, just to let you see what it's like for divers to see them. They're very curious, very gentle animals. They can be approached very closely as long as you don't spook them and you approach them gently. They sometimes also come and hang out over divers and let the bubbles tickle them. And they'll literally swim over your head all the time when they see you. As long as you kind of stay calm and gentle, they will approach you. Now you will see like there's a lot of other fish around it. So many fish use the whale shark. So this is very common with large marine animals, that other small animals use it as structure or shelter to hide from other predators. And you also have these remoras, which have suckers that kind of help them cling onto the whale shark. So they literally hitch a ride on the whale shark. Sometimes they'll detach, free swim, feed on something. When they see some food, they will feed on that, then swim back and attach onto the whale shark. And then they will hitch a ride. And these whale sharks migrate across the Indian Ocean. The ones that come here sometimes move to the Maldives, to Thailand. So they travel large distances. So these remoras also travel the world's oceans, hitching a ride on whale sharks and other animals like whales and turtles and other sharks as well. Or I'm just going to fast forward this a little bit. Almost done. Okay, so talking of marine habitats, I talked about reefs and some of the animals found in them. Something unique to Colombo, kind of special about Colombo, is the concentration of shipwrecks. Probably the largest number of shipwrecks in one place in Sri Lanka. While we get shipwrecks around Sri Lanka, in Colombo you get quite a lot in a small area. This picture is from the newest shipwreck in Colombo called the Thermopylae Sierra. It's off towards Ratmalana Moratuwa area, sank in 2012. You can actually still see this from land. There's part of the ship sticking out of the land, especially from Dehiwala or Mount Lavinia area. If you stand on the beach, you can see it. So if you look at this picture underwater, you can see the towers of the ship kind of going up towards the sky. And you see the dark bit at the bottom. Now that section is underwater. So algae and various marine animals have settled on it. There is some corrosion on it. So that's turned into this darker color. But if you look right to the top of the picture, you will see kind of that turns into a whiter color. that section is actually sticking out of the water. So the paint is still on, and that's what you can see from shore. So this picture is taken from underwater pointing upwards, and you can see the section sticking out of the water as well. And this has, over the last, I guess, 8 years, become, you know, a magnet for marine life. You can see all these small fish there. And not only the fish, sorry, you also have corals settling on it. Now, again, corals grow off Colombo. Contrary to some reports that were seen in the news media recently that corals do not grow off Colombo, they do grow off Colombo, including new coral growth. On this shipwreck, you can see these small coral colonies. Corals don't grow immediately when a shipwreck sinks because there's various paints and chemical coatings on shipwrecks. As these things wear off and as certain types of algae and other marine organisms settle on it, they create a habitat that is conducive for corals to settle. So after a few years, you will find that these coral larvae that float in the plankton water column, they will come and settle on these wrecks. Now you can see various coral colonies here, almost like digitate or branching corals beginning to grow, because this is quite shallow. This is at about 7-8 meters. It's a lot of sunlight, so corals really like that kind of condition. So corals have started growing on it. So over time, these can basically turn into something like this. This is another wreck called the Pêcheur Breton of a French owned ship that sank, I think in 1993, of Dahiwala. Now this has been in the water for longer. You can see the funnel of this ship completely covered in coral, all these kind of orange, yellow colors. It's all these tubestria or cup corals encrusting it. You won't see these colors underwater, but because I've used a kind of a flash to take the pictures, it brings out the colors because the water kind of absorbs the red spectrums. But they are very colorful and there's a lot of coral. Similarly, another somewhat older shipwreck, the Chief Dragon, or popularly known as the Car Wreck. This wreck is just west of the Colombo harbor. You can see how much coral there is. Here you can see the colors. You can see some fish schooling around it as well, but there's so much color and so much coral. I would say more coral than many reefs in Sri Lanka, covering every inch of it. Now these wrecks then can have soft corals as well. This is another smaller barge of Colupitia. This one has a lot of soft corals. If you see these kind of tree-like structures, these are actually black corals. So an interesting fact about black corals is that they're actually mostly white. The word black coral comes from the jewelry trade because they used to take these kind of the stem structures of these, and once they're dried and polished, they turn a black color. So in the jewelry trade, they were called black corals, but underwater, they're not really black. But some of these deeper wrecks actually have a lot of these black corals growing on them. And they create these amazing seascapes, you know, amazing photo opportunities, these beautiful habitats with these kind of like Christmas trees growing on it. They're really, really beautiful and perfect for underwater photography. So these wrecks also attract large numbers of fish because they're perfect places for fish to hide. You can see the amount of fish just under one of these small barges. And this is very common for all the wrecks in Colombo. Very, very high numbers of schooling fish aggregating around them. Just like this is another deeper wreck. Again, these are snappers, big eye snappers, very common around on wrecks and reefs in Sri Lanka. And over time, they kind of evolve into these amazing kind of habitats. If you look at this, a mature wreck with a lot of soft corals, hard corals growing on it, very colorful, lots of fish. You have these in the front, these small golden fish there, like they're called anthias. In the background, you have other snappers schooling, and they're really, really beautiful places to visit. Again, another wreck that we dive regularly. You can see all the fish and coral life on these as well. And of course, not only fish, divers like to visit these wrecks as well. If you have such, seascapes, opportunities for photography, opportunities to see beautiful fish life, corals, potentially a whale shark, they're really attractive for divers. This is on the Car Wreck. A friend of mine diving, actually the co-founder of Blue Resources, Daniel Fernando. diving with me. So they're increasingly becoming popular amongst divers. So talking of wrecks, you can't talk of wrecks and only talk of marine biodiversity. Every wreck has a story. And in particular, two wrecks of Colombo have a very interesting story. The SS Perseus and the SS Worcestershire. Very briefly, I'll tell you a little bit of the history of these. These were two British armed merchantmen that served in World War I. They were actually merchant marine ships that got commissioned for war service. So they got fitted with a few guns and mostly did troop transport or supplying the British military during the First World War from 1914 to 1918. So both these ships were sunk off Colombo. They hit German-laid sea mines. I don't know how many of you are aware that the German Navy was active off Colombo in the early 1900s during World War I. It's a great story of the ship that sank this called the SMS Wolf. I don't have time to describe that in the talk, maybe in the questions, but you can Google it. There's a book about it. Read about the SMS Wolf. But that accounted for the sinking of the Perseus and the Worcestershire in February 1917. So both these wrecks have been located. They've been known by fishermen, but actually documented really well and identified by Darshana Jayawardena, who did a lot of diving trying to identify these wrecks. And this is a picture of the Perseus today. Doesn't look anything like it was before it sank, but it's a fantastic place to dive, lots of fish, lots of corals, so much history involved with World War I and naval maritime history. This again is the kind of the bridge section of the Perseus. You can see soft corals growing on this as well. So talking of all these things that you have in marine life in Colombo, what are some of the opportunities we have with it, other than just saying it's there? So obviously there are lots of economic opportunities, potential for tourism as Sri Lanka moves forward, looking at opportunities for tourism. There's a lot of talk about building Colombo as a destination for tourists, but I rarely see these things discussed amongst the tourism circles. Scuba diving, if you have amazing shipwrecks, marine life like this, probably some of the best diving in Sri Lanka. You have a tremendous opportunity to promote scuba diving. Now, I personally own a dive shop, but it is the only dive shop in Colombo. For some reason, even the dive industry is reluctant to kind of explore this because it's just setting out of your comfort zone when people are not exploring new opportunities. But there is a tremendous opportunity to grow dive tourism on these sites and use them for economic benefit. There is opportunities for sport fishing. Again, happens on a small scale, but a much better sport fishing industry has, especially in the offshore waters, for pelagic fishing. Marine mammal watching. It's not going to be like Mirissa or Kalpitia, where you have the same numbers of dolphins or big aggregations of blue whales. But there's definitely opportunities to see marine mammals, dolphins pretty frequently, and in the right season, you can see whales. Again, you don't see them as frequently if you don't look for them. Now, we see a few when we go out diving, but even myself personally, we don't spend a lot of time trying to document where the animals are moving, which season is the best, where are they most found, because we are busy doing research or other diving. So if you put a bit more effort, you can try to track these animals and kind of start spotting them. And birding. Birding is not only on land. I'm sure people like Rex will reiterate this. There's so many seabirds that you get off Colombo. We see when we're out on the boats. They also come close to shore, especially on the famous or infamous rocks along Mount Lavinia Beach that many birds used to settle on. But also offshore on flotsam or flying around, there's really interesting tourism or ecotourism, marine nature-based tourism opportunities that Sri Lanka has not explored or Colombo has not really developed. But it is slowly changing. So Sri Lanka probably is now better known outside Sri Lanka's diving circles than in Sri Lanka. Several international photographers have done articles on Colombo's wrecks reefs and marine lives in international dive magazines. The word is getting out there. So these are just some screenshots of Sport Diver, which is one of the biggest British dive magazines. While Sri Lanka, the National Geographic documentary series, if any of you have watched it, most of the underwater footage in that documentary was shot in Colombo. So there is a recognition that Colombo has amazing marine life. And most of the underwater footage, I will reiterate, except the whale shots, which were done in Mirissa and Trincomalee. So the reef and wrecks and all the marine life was done in Colombo. So there is a growing recognition. And as someone who is involved with the dive industry as well, we have seen kind of a growing interest amongst international divers and dive groups in visiting Colombo and diving these shipwrecks. So there is tremendous potential to grow this. And of course, while we talk about tourism and the future of the potential, many locals always knew about the value of Colombo's marine life. We have extensive coastal fisheries in this area, a lot of small scale fishers. We don't think of Colombo as a fishing town, but places like Dehiwala are still fishing villages when you get down to the beach. A lot of small scale fishermen as well. And these are the fishermen who often get ignored in major development or major fisheries debates. They actually have less impact on the environment. And the ones that I think you can work with sustainably, like the fishermen you see on this orua or the canoe, who mostly fish using hand lines, a very sustainable method of fishing. There's a lot of lobster fisheries. Colombo still continues to be an important place to collect lobsters for export, and ornamental fish collection for aquariums. The entire industry actually originated in Colombo and still probably has one of the highest numbers of fish collectors based out of Colombo. So locals have always known this. If you get down to the beach, it's just that the rest of Colombo and the world is just beginning to realize what we have. But of course, as we all know, and as we've seen things in the media recently, this is severely threatened and the future is uncertain. Primarily, I would say number one, coastal development. And when I say development, it's not just development itself is bad, but unplanned or unregulated or unsustainable development. If you don't plan it right, it's a big problem, especially direct habitat loss, but also you have sedimentation. When you have dredging or filling activities, it stirs up so much sediment that settles on the reef and smothers the corals and kills these corals. So this is a big problem as Colombo expands and grows and develops. This is threatening. Many of the nearshore reefs are now in very poor condition, even in my lifetime. And I haven't been diving for as long as some others, but I mean, even in the 20 to 25 years that I have been snorkeling and diving off Colombo, I have seen a significant loss of habitat or degradation and water quality as well. So the water now near shore, close off the beach, is very murky. It's very brown and murky. It's not the clear water we used to see 20 years ago. So the sedimentation and pollution, both the visible pollution that we see, like the recent pictures from Mount Lavinia Beach, with all the plastic, which is what we see, but also the invisible pollution, the chemicals, the sewage, all the other stuff that is released into the water. Colombo pumps primarily untreated sewage into the water. We also have, through the canals and rivers, a lot of other contaminants entering the water. This is not always visible, but there is a lot of pathogens, harmful substances that are in the water that are toxic to us and toxic to the marine life. And then in a roundabout way, toxic to us when we consume some of that marine life as well. So that is a problem. Ship anchoring, as Colombo Harbor gets busier, a lot of the ships are waiting to go in outer anchorage, and we haven't clearly demarcated sensitive habitats. So in many countries, they will have areas that they identify as sensitive marine habitats that you should not anchor in. To my knowledge, this has not been done. And I mentioned earlier those offshore coral reefs. There have been several places where we have found ships have anchored in such places. They have dragged their anchor, and basically it's like a bulldozer going on the seabed, dragging these anchors, you know, destroying all those corals, turning those bommies or coral heads upside down and uprooting them. And there's a lot of damage, and this is only going to get worse as the shipping traffic increases. Now, these are simple things we can avoid by designating no anchorage zones. Overfishing is a problem. I did mention that the fishing pressure is relatively lower and it's more small scale fisheries. But when it comes to certain species or certain reefs, fishing can be too much. All around Sri Lanka, and Colombo is no exception, things like sharks and rays have declined in numbers dramatically because they have been targeted as high value species. Big groupers have been heavily spearfished, again for the export trade. So because of this, certain animals have basically disappeared. You have these schools of fish, but you don't have some of the bigger fish or some of the bigger predators. They have been removed. And also in some places, nets getting entangled on reefs and causing what we call ghost nets, because they kind of hang around there and continue to trap fish and kill fish and other marine life like turtles. They are a problem as well. Less than in other parts of Sri Lanka, but still a problem in Colombo. And again, we don't know how much worse it will get. So really what we do today and determines what we have. I mean, I have been very fortunate to dive in Colombo for more than 20 years. Some of the people I know for much longer. And we hope that 20 years from now, not just us, but the next generation of divers will get to experience this amazing marine life. So I really like this picture of one of my friends I mentioned earlier, Darshana Jayawardena, who worked a lot on the Perseus and Worcestershire wrecks. This is him on a dive we did to the Perseus, going into the blue. So essentially, I look at the future like this, going into the unknown. It looks kind of clear, but it's not clear what lies ahead. So really, the actions that our policymakers do, the efforts that we make to raise awareness and spread the word and kind of ensure that this is managed better and development is done in a more sustainable manner will determine what the future holds and what the bottom of the ocean or the deep blue holds for the future. So I'll end it there and we can open it up for questions and discussion, and any specific questions I'll be happy to answer as best as I can. Thank you.
Thanks. That was extremely engaging. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Extremely engaging. So folks, we know what we have around us, the beauty, the treasures around us, literally and metaphorically, the marine treasures. We know what looms ahead of us, and we know how we can lever that, lever those assets to best see how we can really propel Sri Lanka forward. As I said, the locals do know about it. It's up to us to see how we can protect it, conserve it, and also nurture it and grow it to ensure that our assets are best utilized and preserved. So I see a couple of questions on the screen. I saw some very interesting ones popping up, Nishan. You would like to take some of those in order? As this is a chat, so we have about 45 minutes to chat up, to engage in the discussion. So I'll leave it to you, Nishan.
I'll try to move through all of them at this point. We don't have too many. So, I think the first one from Dayani about coral bleaching and global warming. Coral bleaching is a big problem in Sri Lanka. We have had big bleaching events in 1998 and 2016. Places like the Bar Reef, Hikkaduwa, the East Coast have been very badly affected, particularly the West Coast and the South Coast. Colombo's reefs and corals on wrecks have also bleached and some have died. But in Colombo, because there is more kind of water movement and currents, and also many of the reefs where the corals grow a little bit deeper, the impact has been less. The impact is much greater in shallow coral reefs because obviously the water warming is more. So Danny, it is a problem in Sri Lanka. We also had in the East Coast bleaching last year. So just like everywhere else, it's a problem. Patrick has asked about pollution from Colombo. It is a huge problem, Patrick. Especially in the coastal, inner waters. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to go swimming off the Kinross beach or anywhere where the canals come in. If you do water quality testing, I recently heard several government officials saying, you know, we don't share the data from our monitoring water quality. It's so polluted that it will affect the tourism industry. I think that's a a very strange and counterproductive thing. It's if you don't put it out there, we don't know the nature of the problem. If you don't know the problem, we're not going to find solutions, because we're living in a bubble that everything is fine. There is a problem, and we don't have to be afraid of the problem. We can find solutions to it. We don't have to pollute it the way we are doing. So it is a huge problem. When you go further offshore, where most of us do more of our diving, it's not as bad, because the water circulation, there's diffusion into it. And naturally it gets diffused or swept away with currents. And like I said, the water is quite clear, probably much clearer than in other places, and the water quality is better. But very close to shore, it's a huge problem. And as the level of pollution increases, obviously the reach is going to get worse and impact more areas. So currently the trend is it's getting worse, and it's not a good thing, and it's going to affect the seafood that people consume caught off Colombo as well. But again, we have to accept it. And the whole point of doing science or research is to share that data, not to hide it saying, oh, tourists won't come, because there's no point building infrastructure and then putting tourists into dirty water, you know. So we need to be a bit more open and find solutions to it. Whale shark pigments, yeah, all whale sharks have these spots. It's part of their body pattern, and they're very unique to every whale shark. And this is used to identify whale sharks as well. So you have databases globally that you can track. That's how we know some of the whale sharks in Sri Lanka have been to other countries, because you can compare that spot pattern with global databases and identify individual sharks. Yeah, so land reclamation, I think I touched on earlier. So direct sedimentation as during dredging and other activities, and of course, direct habitat loss. The port city resulted in kind of loss of some marine habitats, coastal marine habitats, and other reclamation. There is a proposed reclamation of the coastal area from Kollupitia down to Tehivala right now, all the way up to the first reef. So this is going to destroy all these reefs directly. And you have impacts beyond that direct area from all the sediments that are disturbed as well. So this is a problem. And when they're dredging in a place, you also disturb sediments and create a lot of problems. Dynamite fishing, I mentioned earlier, is not a problem in Colombo. We don't know, we don't have records of dynamite fishing happening, and I personally have never encountered it. It is illegal in Sri Lanka. It's been for many, many decades, but not very well enforced. Periodically, there are efforts by the Navy to kind of round up people who do it in other parts of the country, but we haven't had a very systematic, organized approach to enforcing regulations. So the agencies haven't set up a long-term sustainable mechanism to do this. What happens is when there's an outcry, you know, someone will speak to the Navy, and the Navy will take some action and arrest some people. But then again, after a year, it kind of slides back to what it used to be. So we need to build mechanisms to enforce this. A lot of our agencies, government agencies, don't have the capacity to be out at sea and enforce, but you can find unique partnerships working with local communities, the Navy and the Coast Guard. In Colombo, the Navy is patrolling all the time, so you can link with them to set up kind of monitoring and surveillance to manage illegal fisheries. It's not only dynamite, there are other types of illegal fishing methods that we need to kind of control. Corals where there are no wrecks, of course, yes, the reefs have corals. And like I said, the offshore reefs have corals as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the nice diving in Colombo is a little bit deep, primarily because now in the last few decades, the nearshore reefs, like the reef you see from Marine Drive where the waves break, which used to be very nice. You know, when I was a teenager, I used to snorkel on that. That's now really impacted by pollution. I don't like to go there, both for health reasons, and it's not very nice. The reef is degraded now. You can barely see anything. So it's because of our own actions, we've kind of destroyed this habitat, so we don't have many shallow areas. So the nice areas that are left are further offshore and deeper, and ideally accessed by scuba divers, except the Thermopylis Sierra wreck that has shallow segments. Part of it sticks out of the water and you can snorkel there, but you do have to go there by boat because it's several kilometers off the coast. There's one on the Mount Lavinia beach. I'm sure that is a topic of interest. I don't want to get into too much time on this because it's been debated extensively in public. And I think the WNPS is being active trying to not only highlight the issue, but kind of push for, better management in the future. I know Graham and several others were talking to me, and we're trying to kind of document this as a case study to at least stop this kind of activity happening in the future. Now, what I will reiterate here is it's not that development itself has to stop. There is always a compromise. Everything, even our own houses are built in possibly former wetlands or forests. So we have, destroyed natural habitats throughout history, but there has to be a systematic approach. We have to identify important or critical habitats and conserve them, and then develop other areas. And we have to follow proper protocols and do a proper feasibility that includes an environmental impact assessment. The reason you do that is not only for environment, but for the success of the project and the financial or economic benefit of that project as well. What happens is we ignore these or we bypass these protocols, and we end up spending more mitigating the negative impacts. If you look on land, people will construct in a landslide prone area or remove the vegetation on a hillside. Then you have a landslide. And then you have millions and millions or billions of rupees loss of property and paying compensation and paying to stabilize a mountainside. Now, this could all have been averted if we just didn't do that. So a policy argument often is we have to develop, we can't just think of environment. There is money that has to be generated. You generate $1 billion and spend another 2 billion mitigating the impacts of this. So it's not feasible or useful even in an economic perspective. Leave the environment away. I mean, I don't consider myself, a traditional environmentalist. I look at things as a resource management perspective. As much as I personally love these animals and species and diving in photography and wildlife, I understand the economic and development needs of the country and the world. But we have to do it in a way that benefits the economy as well, not just do arbitrary projects. So the issue with that Mount Lavinia thing is that the protocols were not followed and the proper modeling of feasibility was not done. And as you can see, it's not really working now. We have new objectives. The original objective given to us was one, and then we have an interim objective, and now you have a different objective. So now apparently it was done for a different reason. You shouldn't have that. This should have been clearly communicated at the start. The reason it wasn't is because they clearly did not do the correct modeling or feasibility or assessments required. If for a good enough reason, we had to lose that area in terms of that bay and those rocks and the marine life there, even as an environmentalist, I would have taken it. I mean, sometimes it's sad, but that's the world is always changing. But not to lose something, to not get anything out of it for the country. And that is kind of what's emerging now. So that is the kind of concern we have, not only with that project, with all the projects. Similar things happen with the port city, similar things happen with other areas. And I, as someone who has been involved in things, I mean, reviewing things or looking at EIAs, this is a big problem in Sri Lanka. And even our entire EIA process has major flaws in it. Even the criteria that they give in the TORs of what to assess doesn't really address all the issues. They are usually making a list of many things. So I have been involved with preparing EIAs, and often it is to prepare a list of the species found in the area, a socioeconomic profile, a biodiversity profile, but it doesn't truly delve into the ecological processes. Making species list is useful, but only up to a certain point. So an argument made in the Colombo port city EIA was someone did an EIA just adjacent to the port city and said, okay, there is not high biodiversity here. Yes, because they only did the EIA right near the port city construction area, which was already degraded due to the port itself. But there was no comparison of external areas and also no relativity. So you can't compare a reef in Colombo to a reef in Pigeon Island and say, oh, Colombo reef has lower number of species. This is what happens with species list. You value something based on a list, the number of species. but you're not valuing it in its contribution to the ecological processes of that local area. So that is ignored in our EIAs. It's often species list and we compare the value. We don't have an endangered species permanently living here. This is fine, we can develop. So we are not looking at the processes. Once you don't do that, you kind of miss out on what might happen in terms of environmental changes, how it might affect the ecosystem, the livelihoods dependent on it. There are, like I mentioned, many people who fish off Colombo, including export-oriented fisheries. So there's foreign exchange that comes to Sri Lanka from the ornamental fish collection, the lobster fisheries. So all of these are negatively impacted. So again, there's a huge economic loss. It's not just this kind of a tree-hugging, Greenpeace advocate environmentalist either. It's a very practical point that we argue. So that's my take on it. I think the details on the Mount Lavinia is out there in the media. I don't have much more to add on that. But the one thing that hasn't got discussed though, is it's not only the impact of the reclamation or the beach renourishment, the impact of the dredging. They were not doing the dredging where it was supposed to have been done. They were dredging very close to some of those wrecks and reefs. And I know personally that was resulting in negative impacts on those sites. That's not been in the media. So there is a big impact through things like that. Again, they didn't have to dredge there. They could have just dredged a few kilometers away and this problem wouldn't have been there. So it's, again, you can do it. You can just do it differently and better. Let me see questions. Kihan asked about how many species of fish you might see on a good day. 100 to 200, if you, depends on how deeply you're looking. About 70 to 100 is common, but if you start really getting into the small stuff like the whip coral gobies and all the different blennies and gobies and kind of cryptic and nocturnal animals that hide under, if you really do what I would say a strict biodiversity survey, you would record maybe above 150, maybe not 200, but you could go above 150. But for an average diver, about 60, 70, 80 species you could see, as long as you know how to identify them and pay attention, you will find this. I think from the records I have of the work I have done, others may have other lists as well, and maybe more species. I think we have something like 270 or 280 or close to 300 species that we've recorded, reef associated fish. So this varies to other fish. There are things that are pelagic fish that we don't always see on the reefs that we don't record on coral reef surveys, but they are found sometimes on dives. But generally I'm referring to reef associated, things that you see on the reef. But on one dive, maybe about 70, 80 is common. Question on the sea lion. I think the sea lion's gone back to where it came from. Let's hope so, that it didn't get well, it was actually a seal, an elephant seal, a northern elephant seal, but sorry, southern elephant seal. So it was temporarily in Colombo's waters. It was expected to leave our waters and go back to its kind of natural habitat in colder waters close to Antarctica. As long as it didn't get entangled in one of the ghost fishing nets, we hope it has reached home safely. So this brings up an important point, actually, this ghost fishing or fishing bycatch, not only ghost fishing. This is a problem around Sri Lanka. The non-target catch of animals in fisheries. So you may be putting a net or a line to catch tuna or trevally or something, but you have a lot of other animals that are accidentally caught. Many of these can be threatened animals, so like marine mammals. In Sri Lanka, the highest mortality of small cetaceans, like dolphins, comes from accidental bycatch, not from direct take or boat strikes or anything else. it's from bycatch. They are constantly getting tangled in these and drowning. It is the same with turtles. I have personally witnessed about 20, 30 turtles dead in one day in Kalpiti area. We frequently encounter dead turtles off Colombo. Fishermen have them entangled in their nets and they drown. So this is a huge problem with, particularly with net fishing, but also with some of the long lines. Seabirds go to take the bait off the lines and swallow the hook and then basically get injured or die. So this is a big problem with fisheries, the kind of the side impact of this. Yeah, Amal's asking about Adams Bridge, not directly Colombo, but I'll answer it anyways, Amal. Adams Bridge is mostly sand case. It's not really coral. It's part of an old land bridge that's partly eroded now. It's mostly sand case or sand islands, that area. There are some coral reefs north and south of that area. North of Mannar and also up to Jaffna, and also south of Mannar to Silavaturi and the Bar Reef, which are coral reefs. But right around the Adams Bridge is not a major coral habitat. It's very shallow and very kind of a bit muddy and sandy. So those are sand islands. Yeah, the usefulness of coral reefs to negate natural kind of impacts. They're very, very important in reducing the wave energy that reaches our shores. They dissipate the wave energy. They're a natural barrier. Even of Colombo, I mean, the first reef, it's not a true coral reef, it's a sandstone reef, but there are some corals on it. You can see the waves breaking on it. So the waves hit the reefs, break it, and the energy gets reduced, and then less energy reaches the shore. Tsunamis, to be honest, the potential for them to mitigate the tsunami impact is not that high. The media kind of, as a scientist, I'll tell you that the media kind of overplayed that after the tsunami, that the coral reefs truly protected, because they wanted to push a conservation theme and try to correlate, places where coral reefs had been mined with damage of the villages to be greater than another place. It may have been, but there are so many other variables. The gradient of the seaflow or the bathymetry, the land, the vegetation patterns, so many other factors that it's very difficult without a detailed study to say that the coral reef itself was the reason for protecting against a tsunami. But you have to realize that a tsunami is a freak event. It's a once in a 100, 200 or 500 or 1,000 years event. But what we have to worry about regularly are storm surges. We have the monsoons and these cyclones and things that happen annually. And these are what causes more coastal erosion and stuff in Sri Lanka. So for that, reefs, coral reefs and all reefs play a vital role in protecting our coastline. And that is very clear in the south coast, where they have mined the coral reefs historically. There is severe erosion, and that is very clearly can be attributed to the removal of the coral reefs from those areas. Lairo, how many wrecks are there and have they all been mapped? Actually, we don't know how many. Sometimes fishermen will tell us that there is another one, and you have to go and investigate. Sometimes you find this. They have not, and obviously they have not all been mapped. The wrecks that we know have been documented, but we don't know the names of all the wrecks. We have tried to check them with harbor masters and ship registries, but we haven't been able to name some of the smaller barges. All the big wrecks we know the name, the country of origin, when it sank, all of that, they're documented. But there are some small boats and barges that we really don't know yet. I'm sure that information exists somewhere. I have personally dived, and we have been able to dive about 15 wrecks of Colombo that we can access. There are several more that we know exist, but are difficult to access. No, sorry, I think 17 wrecks that we can access. We just don't dive a couple of them because they're not very nice. There are a few more that are difficult to access because of their location very close to the harbor. So there's a harbor perimeter area that you are not allowed to go to for safety reasons and shipping traffic. And so for reasons like that, some cannot be accessed, but we know they exist and we know what they are. But there are records of other ships sinking off Colombo. The problem is some of the historical records don't give you an exact GPS coordinate. It kind of tells you, 10 miles due west of Colombo or something like that. And that's the point they noted when it was sinking. These things also drift while they're sinking and settle somewhere else. So we may have a few more that we don't know. But I think about 17 wrecks that we know for sure that we can access as scuba divers and dive. Patrick, in terms of the Navy supporting marine conservation, they have been involved, but not enough. But partly, I think the onus is on the other agencies like the Department of Wildlife and the Department of Fisheries to work with the Navy and make sure that these conservation priorities and objectives are on the work plan, on the agenda of the Navy. When you have a naval vessel patrolling, the Navy officers have other objectives. So they are patrolling not to look for illegal fisheries. But it's important that these other agencies work closely with them and give them the information required on what they need to be looking for, what to detect. When the Navy is clearly aware, they do take action. But in many cases, the Navy is not even aware of some of the regulations. And they have also not been requested or by the other agencies to help them enforce. So this is what I talk about, a mechanism to enforce. You have to find kind of joint enforcement mechanisms that many other countries do to use the available resources. There's no need to have another marine patrol unit or wildlife boat going out patrolling when we have boats patrolling. So as long as you kind of coordinate better and have a clear mandate and a mechanism to communicate and enforce, we can do this better. But yes, the Navy does sometimes make arrests. They usually hand them over to the Department of Fisheries for prosecution because the Department of Fisheries will then take it to court under the Fisheries Act. So it does happen, but certainly not as much as it could, but it's a very, very useful resource. And I think the Navy is open to supporting that and they can be used better. There's a question on the Aruwakalu fossil bed. I'm sorry, I'm not very knowledgeable about that. So I'm going to refrain from answering that, not to avoid it, but because it's not, okay. Sorry, let me just add one thing. Again, not Colombo related, but those are basically fossilized shells and other fragments from previous sea levels. So there was a time when the sea level was actually higher. There was a time it was lower. There was a time when it was higher, especially during the period called the Holocene. So I think it's about 6,000 years ago. I may be wrong, I'm not a geologist. But so at that time, these deposits happen. So you get them in the south coast as well, where they mine or quarry for limestone inland, and you can find ancient coral fragments and shell fragments. That's as much as I know. Beyond that, I think someone more knowledgeable about geology will have to answer beyond that. We know what are the other types of illegal fishing other than dynamite fishing and bottom trawling. One of the problematic ones is bottom set nets. These are nets that are laid on the bottom with weights, and there's lines and floats coming to the surface, and then they'll lay it and they'll pull it up. These are laid mainly for lobsters and some species of bottom dwelling fish. The problem with these, when you lay them on reef areas, is the nets get entangled on the corals. And when you're pulling them up, you break parts of the reef or parts of the corals and bring it up as well. And along that with other marine invertebrates, things like sea stars, sea urchins, lots of stingrays. These things get caught in these and they're problematic. So they have been prohibited in Sri Lanka, but they're very, very commonly used. They are used in Colombo as well. If there was a single illegal fishing method in Colombo that I would like to see disappear off Colombo, it would be bottom set nets. Dynamite we don't like, but it doesn't happen in Colombo, and bottom trawling doesn't happen in Colombo. But bottom set nets do happen in Colombo, and that's a big problem. So they're both destructive and illegal. In general, extensive use of nets, very large nets, is not good because they tend to have high rates of bycatch. But many of the nets, like the gill nets they use, are not illegal in Sri Lanka. They're the common method, so you can't blame the fishermen if it's not illegal. It's not an ideal thing, but okay, they have to fish as well. But bottom set nets are illegal, they're very destructive, and they're commonly used around Sri Lanka. Spearfishing, as of 2 years ago, is illegal in Sri Lanka, but still is practiced. It's practiced quite frequently off Colombo as well. Spearfishing in Sri Lanka is a problem because of the way they do it. In many parts of the world, spearfishing is probably one of the better forms of fishing because you can target the fish you want. You don't have this bycatch or damaging the habitat with nets or anything. And you pick out the fish you want and you take it. But spearfishing traditionally is done by free diving or breath hold diving, not using scuba tanks. So it's actually evolved as a kind of a sport hunting as well. So it's a challenge. You have to hold your breath. You can only go down to a certain depth and stay for a certain amount of time. You have to be able to find the fish, shoot it, and bring it up. So it's not easy. And so you can't catch a lot of fish or overfish anything. So it's quite sustainable. So it's either done in other countries, in developed countries, they will do it as a hobby or a sport where people go and do it as a challenge. And then they will, of course, shoot 2 or 3 fish, bring it, and they'll eat it. In poorer countries, local communities spearfish to feed themselves and their families. It's artisanal fisheries. Again, the impact is not very high, so it's a good form of fishing. In Sri Lanka, however, because of the demand for the export market for things like groupers, people started getting into commercial spearfishing using scuba diving. So you can stay for long periods of time, go deeper, and they're diving 4 or 5 tanks a day, so 4 or 5 dives every day. So they fish out the shallow reef, then they go to the deeper reef, they fish out, and they start shooting everything. It's not 1 or 2 fish and saying, I have enough to feed my family. It's, if I can shoot 50 fish, I will shoot them. And you start selecting all the big animals, the breeding adults are taken out. So that has a major impact on the population. So that's why spearfishing was made illegal in Sri Lanka. Otherwise, spearfishing is quite, if you could say, ethical, as long as you consider killing any animal an ethical practice. It is one of the better forms of fishing in the world. And that's how the original people spearfished. I mentioned the reef combers and all of that. At that time, they were all breath hold divers, spearfishing more as a hobby. And that was not a problem. It's not a problem. It's very commonly done. But in Sri Lanka, because of the way it became commercial, we had to make it illegal. Let me see, where are my other questions? Equipment to take pictures and videos. I use standard DSLR camera. Most photographers use that if you're doing serious photography. If you're doing, I mean, you can use a point and shoot camera as well, but just like on land, the good DSLR or in now mirrorless cameras are the best. What we do is we put them in an underwater housing. This can be the aluminum or plexiglass or plastic cover. The more expensive good ones are, high-end ones are aluminum. And you use lights. If anyone wants to do underwater photography, the most important thing is having decent, at least, if not very good, at least a decent light or multiple lights, because the water kind of absorbs the red and orange kind of wavelengths in light. So you lose those colors as you go deeper. So without having lights, you won't see the colors that you see in the pictures that that's quite important to have. But you can take pretty nice pictures with a simple camera. I use a Canon DSLR in an underwater housing with 2 lights. Um, Microplastics and plastics in marine animals. Microplastics, I personally don't know the level of contamination, but I know from some work that MIPA has done some limited work. They are finding microplastics in fish. Uh, I'm not sure the extent of it, to be honest, but it is a problem. But in larger marine animals like turtles and whales, uh, they have found larger plastics, not just microplastic, but things like plastic bags in their stomachs when they do a gut analysis of dead animals. So they are ingesting. Turtles are particularly vulnerable because quite a few turtles feed on jellyfish, and a plastic bag floating in the water from a distance resembles a jellyfish. It looks a lot like a jellyfish floating around. So turtles can almost actively ingest it by thinking it's a jellyfish and feeding on it. So that is a problem. I've actually seen this happen as well. Um, turtles trying to eat plastic bags. So it's a problem, and eventually, it strangles their gut and potentially kills them. WNPS involvement in marine conservation, I think Graham probably is better to answer that.
Okay, a long one. Thanks, Nishan. Patrick, yeah, so as far as marine is concerned, probably engage you sometime, but yeah, so there are various levels of advocacy, such as the one that is happening now. What we generally do is we try and engage as many of the stakeholders in all these things as possible to ensure that that there is process, there is awareness, there is knowledge of whatever that is taken on. For example, if there is a project that we see that, for example, even in the beach project, we've given our views. We've talked about engaging the people concerned, because in this whole thing, it's a synergy of many bodies, many institutions that has to come together to ensure that that results are eventually delivered. When I say results, what we're saying, what's best, what the best outcome is. So yes, the WNPS has scientists, we have the knowledge, we have the IP, we have one of the oldest organizations in the country, probably 126 years old, and we engage and always looking to engage in partners, Nishan said, in sensible conservation. We all know that there is a need for development. We all know, as I said at the outset, how do we utilize these assets of ours for tourism? I mean, that's the question. The question is, you recognize what our strengths are, you recognize what we have vis-a-vis other countries, and then we say, okay, this is what we have the knowledge to tell you what we have, and this is the way it should be handled. So it's a long drawn out process, Patrick, and yes, we do engage bodies, we do engage stakeholders, and we also have chats like this to bring about awareness and to ensure that people do understand the merits, demerits of things that
I think you got muted.
Yeah, so no, I lost. So that's the merits, and in saying that, I think we have probably 5 to 10 minutes more. Am I still mute?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. I think I picked up something very interesting you said in one of the chats probably last week. See, and I'm just going to put it to you. I mean, this is something I'd love to hear you probably talk on. See, Sri Lanka is unique in, we have our marine assets and our marine strengths. I'm talking here business. Our competitive advantage is totally different to country X or country Y. It's probably not the beaches per se. It's probably not the infrastructure on the beaches per se, as you said. The real value, the real assets we have are down there. I said the wrecks, the reef, the marine biodiversity. So I think the question is, how do we focus our efforts to ensure that that is nurtured, and efforts to add value via that, versus probably adding value via, say, probably a hotel or a beach. I'm not saying it will be there, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Saying. Yeah, should the focus.
I was actually thinking of bringing that point up as well.
Yeah, and I got it from what you said. I think it's very important.
And there was a question from us about the opportunities for scuba diving tourism. So I think I can touch on that through this. Yeah, so we talk so much about tourism, and I'm not the first and only person to talk about this issue, in the sense that many have pointed this out. What I said that day was that we seem more focused on the infrastructure, in this, not even infrastructure, on hotel development. Now, I'm not saying that is unimportant. It is very important, but it is only one part of the process. And the hotels are not the attraction that brings the tourists here. They're an auxiliary service for the visitor. Okay, they're an accommodation service provider. There are, like I said that day, there are a few very, very unique hotels in the world where people will go just to stay in those hotels. Let's be honest, we don't have hotels like that in Sri Lanka. And if you look at most of those hotels as well, there's something very unique about their destination, and often they're located in amazing natural environments with beautiful views or activities to do or experience nature or something. And on top of that, they've elevated your stay with this luxury resort or, you know, an amazing hotel. But what drives the person to come there is the attraction. Okay. But now we hear a lot about tourism development and how we are going to expand the room numbers and all of these, but we do it destroying what we actually have as an attraction and not identifying the needs of the visitors. Because like you clearly pointed out and rightly pointed out, we always have these things of we are going to be like Bali, we are going to be like Maldives. We can't be like Maldives and we can't be like Bali. You know, I mean, personally, when the Kalpitiya development started, everyone said, oh, we can have these island resorts and water bungalows. I mean, Maldivian islands are not the same as Kalpitiya's islands. I mean, if anyone who says that is not thinking straight. So it's different, but doesn't mean that Kalpitiya is not a unique destination that can be developed, but you can't put that other model. And we only do half of it. So we say we want to develop a unique beach destination. Now, a good example of this, I think, is a failed project is Pasikuda. When Pasikuda was first developed, they were said, oh, this is going to be a standalone beach destination where people are going to come just for their beach vacation instead of going to Maldives. This is going to be. But in the Maldives, you have one resort on one island, except for a couple of islands, most resorts on their own island. You have exclusivity, you have beautiful marine life, and they don't fish on the reef around the resort. It's very clean, you know. Then in Pasikuda, you have 14 resorts built wall to wall. Now that is mass tourism, not exclusive tourism. You can't charge $1,000 a night when your resort is separated from a wall from another resort. In the middle of that, you have the local public beach. I have nothing against the local public beach, but you have to do planning where you structure it in such that you don't have that in the middle of the resort stretch. You know, so you have, you know, all the locals coming and littering. It's noisy on a Sunday or a holiday, and you want this to be an exclusive beach resort. But no one focused on developing activities to do. If you go to Pasikuda, I mean, I work a lot in Pasikuda for my research, so I know the area well. There's nothing much to do. What are the attractions? They have jet skis and banana boats. Now, you could do jet skiing anywhere in Sri Lanka or anywhere. You don't have to drive for 6 hours or take a $200 Cinnamon Air flight to go and ride a jet ski. You know, why would you go to Pasikuda? What are the attractions that make it special to be there? You have nice resorts that are empty, not because of the COVID or the Easter Sunday attacks. They have been empty most of the time since they were built. They just change management and ownership because nobody comes there. So this is the problem. You have to have a reason for a person to go there beyond just the resort. The resort is an added thing. I mean, I travel as a tourist for diving to other parts of the world, and I look at dive destinations. The first thing I look at is the diving I want to go and do. Then I look at destinations and the hotels and the dive operators and all of that. So you have to prioritize and then first identify what your niche is for not just the country, for a particular area. In Sri Lanka is very diverse, which is what's unique. And each region or area has unique attractions, unique opportunities. You can't have this one model planted in every place. So you figure that out and then look at what is the infrastructure we need and the investment we need to develop that. Okay, then, okay, we have a shortage of accommodation. We fill that gap. But what type of accommodation? What are the types of tourists? Now, of course, Colombo has many types of tourists. It's not only marine wildlife and all of that. Of course, it's a city. There's business travelers. There'll be people coming for shopping. So there's diverse groups. I'm not saying it's only for marine one, but there are also potential opportunities for marine wildlife or nature-based activities. There could at least be an add-on to an attraction to a visitor in Colombo. Being in the dive industry, I experience this of people coming. And I don't know, some of you might be surprised to know that there are tourists who come to Sri Lanka, spend a week in Colombo, scuba dive our wrecks and leave Sri Lanka without leaving Colombo. And they have no interest in going anywhere else. And I myself as a diver, I travel to countries like Indonesia, and all I do is I spend 2-3 weeks diving and I don't go to see any other attraction. I'm not, you know, every dollar I can spend on the holiday is on dive because they're very unique. Like birders, you will go to see birding or wildlife tourists. So wreck diving is something that we can promote in Sri Lanka, and Colombo has a great opportunity. But we don't have the infrastructure for that. We don't have proper facilities to anchor a boat or tie up a boat. We don't have proper regulations on boating. We have no system to register boats in this country. So usually it involves talking to someone and getting a letter from the Ministry of Defense, something, but that's not a process. There is no proper process for that. So how do you, you know, if you look at the dive tourism industry in other countries, the quality of the boats, the service provision, the staff, it's so much higher than in Sri Lanka. So I always say we talk about doing high-end tourism, but we want to give them a backpacker experience. We want to charge a lot, but the tourist has to go in a ramshackle converted fishing boat, or they have to go in a horrible jeep on a safari. You don't have good guides. So we are not investing to change that. We just say we have something and we compare it with another country. It's very easy to say, you know, someone spends so much for a night in Maldives. Someone pays so much for a day's safari in South Africa. But the experience you get is different. I mean, I traveled to Fiji to do shark diving. I paid $180 for the daily dive trip for a day for 2 dives. In Sri Lanka, you can dive in the South Coast for $60 a day, 2 dives. But you dive with a fantastic operator. You dive at sanctuaries where you see these big sharks like tiger sharks, you know, approach you and you can photograph them. You can't have fishing and diving on the same site. So you have areas set aside for fishing, you have areas set aside for diving. But here we want to fish the same shark that we want to show the tourists. And then we want the tourists to come here instead of going to Fiji or Maldives, but we are not looking at this attraction. That, I think, is a fundamental disconnect with what we are doing. And we build hotels and we say no one's coming. We want to grow the dive industry, but we don't want to preserve the attraction that brings them. And it's not just diving. I mean, people have been fighting about this for Yala and other places, but it's the same with the marine life. If you go with whale watching, you really have literally a third world whale watching operation, and you want to make it high end and expensive and have high paying tourists to come and go, and, you know, in a crowded environment, you don't have exclusive. Now there are places like Tonga where they do whale snorkeling. I know it's been controversial in Sri Lanka, but done well, I think it's better than whale watching. They don't allow whale watching in those areas. They have whale snorkeling. It's very highly regulated, very few operators, and only a limited number of tourists are allowed. There's a waiting list to go on it. You cannot just fly into Tonga and get on one of those boats. You want to book at least a year ahead. For diving, it's the same. Places like Sipadan in Malaysia, they have a quota of how many visitors can go to Sipadan Marine Park for diving. You have to contact the operator ahead. So you have to usually book about 7-8 days to get 2 or 3 days inside the marine park. The other days, you get to dive outside the marine park. And if you book enough days, you will get on the quota and get a few days. You can't just turn up at the marine park and get on a boat. But you pay and you do it. But in Sri Lanka, we don't want to do that. We want to just, you know, we want high-end tourism that is also mass tourism that has a backpacker quality of experience. So this is a problem. I mean, I'm not a tourism expert, but I think these are common sense things that we need to do. And then the infrastructure, depending on the needs of that particular location, we can develop. But we put the cart before the horse. We have built a hotel, everything, and then we are wondering why no one comes.
Super. Thanks, Nishan. I think that was something I was waiting to open out with you, and I think something all of us can really work on for sure. So we got probably 5 minutes left. I have see a couple of questions on FB, I think relevant ones from Rukshan and Amal. I'm just going to pose those to you. From Rukshan, do you feel there could be, should be protection for coastal sharks such as the black-tip reef shark? From Rukshan. And shark related again from Namal, shark fin soup is still available in restaurants. Is this banned or can we have it banned?
What was the first one? Can it be or should it be protected?
So are we saying, do you feel there should be protection for coastal sharks such as the black-tip reef shark, which we saw caught the other day off the coast of Salawat?
I mean, all sharks in Sri Lanka are not doing well. So we need to look at more protections for sharks. It's difficult to completely ban shark fishing. One thing is practically difficult because they can be caught as bycatch. You know, when you put a fishing line with a hook, you don't know what's going to take the bait. And often these sharks, once they're caught and by the time they're taken up, are too stressed to actually survive. So you could, but you can stop the direct take, but maybe a phased approach. Another thing in Sri Lanka is that we try to change this overnight. So, you know, if you suddenly bring a law banning something, the fishing industry is going to go crazy. You know, you have to phase it out, and you have to look at it from their point that they can't suddenly stop something, but we have to look at a phased approach. And an easy thing to do would be to stop the trade or consumption of that. Now, there are a few species of sharks that are now listed on CITES, so the international trade is restricted and the fishery for that is coming down. And we have effectively banned the fishing for thresher sharks. And while, yes, they are illegally landed still, the numbers landed have declined. That's the thing. You will never have 100% compliance, but it is much better in terms of the numbers caught. So you can slowly work towards bans of some species of sharks that may be more vulnerable based on science and data and population assessments. But you can also stop the use. So that's Nama's question. Shark fin soup is available because most sharks are legal to catch, trade, and eat in Sri Lanka. There's only a few that are listed on CITES, and that only restricts the trade going out of Sri Lanka, so international trade. The thresher shark and a few other sharks are protected in Sri Lanka. The whale shark is protected in Sri Lanka, but all the other sharks are not protected in Sri Lanka. So it is legal, but kind of starting with discouraging the consumption of that, and then moving towards a prohibition of those things would be a starting point, and then progressively moving towards restrictions on these fishing methods, and then also maybe a closure of a certain fishery. The other thing is that more effectively, we have to manage our marine protected areas better, because that's the tool to at least try and enforce all these laws in one small area. So you create these refuges for these animals to live in. And for things like black-tip reef sharks, even a relatively smaller marine protected area can have impacts. As you know, in Pigeon Island, you find them very regularly where you don't see them anywhere else because there is less fishing there. So it can be effective. And then you can have spillover. When they breed, excess numbers will spill out of a marine sanctuary into other areas as well. So that's another thing of using marine protected areas more effectively, elevating them from paper parks to actual protected areas.
Fantastic. So we got probably 4 minutes more. Is there anything, Nishan, that you see there as I've seen some questions from Gihan and Tina. I'll engage you on that off the loop on prices for boats and advocacy. Sent you notes. So anything that you see that you'd like to take as one more question, Nishan?
Just trying to see. A quick one. We know the U-like structure sticking out of the water is the part of that Thermopylae Sierra wreck I mentioned earlier. I showed that picture with the dark bits underwater and the white bits sticking out. So that's what you see from the show. It's part of a shipwreck. Let me see. I don't know. Sorry, I've missed where I was, but I don't know if there's any specific question itself.
Fine. So I think,
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think what you just said sums it all, Nishan. The point you were making based on my question, I think it's a systemic approach to this whole thing. As I said, all these chats are to give visibility and a view on the totality of it. You know, as you said, it's just not conservation for the sake of conservation. It's looking at it, looking at how what we have, analyzing Sri Lanka as a country, what its marine assets are, what we can take, what we can offer as value-added tourism, what we need to do as process. So I think it leaves us with a lot of thought, and also tells you where WNPS would like to head in bringing out all this and bringing out awareness. So if there are any one of you out there who would like to join us, who have the knowledge, we're always willing. Another hat of IP is always welcome. And with that, Nishan, thank you so much. That was an extremely engaging session. Love to have you again. And thank you so much for giving us your Saturday morning. And really do appreciate it on behalf of the whole of the WNPS and all of us out there who've been absolutely enthralled for the last 2 hours. Thank you so much again. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. And thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully it was useful for you. And I quite enjoy sharing something that I'm very passionate about and very close to as a diver living in Colombo and growing up here. It's where I probably dive the most. And I can be very, very passionate. And I mean, I could probably go on for 6 hours on this. So it was fun for me as well. So it was my pleasure. And yeah, hopefully we'll engage together.
Super.
in
Leaves us with the message that we have a treasure on our doorstep. So let's look after it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nishan, thank you everyone. Thanks for joining. All the best. Have a great weekend. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'm on.